Hi, this is Matt Brown, and today I'm going to be doing a complete disc brake conversion on this 1966 Fleetwood Series 75 sedan. I ordered all the parts from Cadidaddy.com, who has complete conversion kits for both front disc, rear disc, as well as a new master cylinder and brake booster that have the correct proportioning valve for this. This car, so far as I know, has the original braking system, four-wheel drums, and it probably hasn't been touched at all, so I'm expecting to be breaking a few bolts loose here today. So what we have here is the original master cylinder and brake booster for this car, or at least original so far as we know. Master cylinder here, brake booster here. There's plenty of room to work around these, but we're going to have to uninstall this entire assembly from the inside of the car. The very first step involved on this is going to be disconnecting the brake booster from the brake pedal inside of the car. So the first step of this process is going to be to remove the brake pedal, or well, detach the brake pedal from the brake booster. In order to do this, we need to come down underneath the dashboard, and up here what we see is that the brake booster has a round arm that sticks out, and there's a cotter pin that goes through right on this end. So that cotter pin is going to have its legs bent back and then slid out so that we can then pop this ring that's part of the brake booster off of the brake pedal assembly. Alright, so that was a tight squeeze, but I eventually got in there, and what you'll see is that the washer and the cotter pin have both been removed. And so if I look up now at the brake pedal, we can see here that the arm that goes to the brake booster is now free to slide off of the brake pedal. Although it won't come quite all the way off yet, we'll probably need to loosen up the brake booster at the firewall to get it completely disconnected. Okay, so the next step involved in this is going to be to disconnect the brake lines from the master cylinder right here. So in order to do that, I'm going to use this 1/2-inch wrench to be able to disconnect this. However, when I pop this out, brake fluid's going to come spilling out of both the master cylinder and out of here. So I want to make sure to have something to catch that, because that brake fluid is really nasty stuff. So what I've done is set up a catch pan, just an oil pan, right down underneath the car here, and that should hopefully catch anything that drips out of there. But I'll also have another container on hand in the car when I take these off. So next step I'll do is disconnect those lines. Alright, so now I've disconnected the front and rear brake lines from the master cylinder, and actually no fluid came out whatsoever. So that would indicate that we've had a leak that's come out of the pipes somewhere in there. Hopefully it's not in the brake lines. If it is, then we're going to have to run new brake lines on here. Otherwise, it's just part of the faulty existing drum brake system that we're going to be removing anyway. Alright, one other thing that we need to do in order to remove the booster is to remove the main vacuum line that goes into the brake booster right here, and that just pops right out. There's just a rubber seal on here, and it may need to work loose a little bit, and there we go, that's popped out, that's removed. So at this point, the only thing holding the booster master cylinder assembly in the vehicle is just 4 bolts that go through the firewall. And so in order to remove the nuts on those bolts, I'm going to have to get up inside of the dashboard. And it's going to be pretty tight up there, so I won't be able to record that. Alright, so all the nuts have now been removed that held the brake booster onto the firewall. And once those nuts were removed, the whole assembly wiggles a little bit, so you can actually pop the ring from the booster off of the brake pedal assembly. So that's now all been disconnected. Incidentally, all those nuts were 9/16. So with everything all disconnected here now, I should just be able to pick up the brake booster and master cylinder and just slide it right out of the assembly here. And that all came out fairly easily. Alright, so what we have here is the brake booster and master cylinder assembly, and this was the kit from Cadidaddy.com, and this also has a proportioning valve put on here to control the amount of fluid pressure so that we can do a front and rear disc brake setup, which was different from the four-wheel drum setup that's on this car. So what I'm going to do is take this assembly here, and here we can see this is the ring that goes on the gas pedal, and here's the studs that go through the firewall. And I'm going to put it through this hole on the firewall here, just where we came out, and it should just slide in very easily. This may tend to get hung up on things like the brake lines that are currently in place. And there we go. Alright, so now that the booster has been put through the firewall, we can actually see here. If I can angle this up, we can see where that new brass ring has gone around the brake pedal. I had to reach in and do that. And then I'm just going to put the nuts back on the studs here, and then this whole assembly will be installed, and then all we have to do is connect the brake lines. As you may be able to see here, the existing brake lines do not line up with the attachment points on the proportioning valve, which can be seen as the brass item underneath the master cylinder. Therefore, the brake lines are going to need to be modified. And so at this point, new fittings will have to be put on and/or extensions. So now that the master cylinder and booster have been installed, the next thing that we're going to do is switch the front end of this car over to be disc brakes rather than the factory drum brakes. Now, I bought the front disc brake conversion kit from caddydaddy.com, and that includes all the parts that are necessary to do this conversion. So at this point, I've now jacked the car up and removed the wheel, and slightly before working on this video, I was banging away for a little while trying to remove the front drum. I've never dealt with front drums before, and I hope this is the last time I'll ever have to touch them again. As it turns out, I've looked up and found out that you actually need to remove the dust cover and the nut, similar to how you would have to do removing the front rotor on an older disc brake car. The same is true for the front drum brake. So I've been banging on this thing with a hammer trying to yank it off the hub for nothing. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove the front dust cover and nut. So now I'm just using a flathead screwdriver to pry this dust cover off, and that should expose the cotter pin and nut which are holding this whole assembly onto the wheel. And we can see that right there, packed in with grease. I'm just going to take some pliers here and bend the legs out so that we can get the cotter pin out. So I'll just get those up in here, get that cotter pin squeezed together, and then shoved through the hole. This may take a little bit of fiddling, and once we're done with it, we'll be able to take the nut off. So now the cotter pin has been removed, which means that this nut can come off. Now this nut is bigger than 1 inch, and I don't have any sockets large enough to do that, but what I can use is just an adjustable wrench, because these nuts don't get torqued on very hard. And so with that adjustable wrench, I can now unscrew the nut that holds the hub on here. Now there's a lot of grease, so get ready to really make a mess of things with this. With that nut removed, that should allow the brake drum assembly to come off. And we can see, wow, that was really easy compared to the banging around that I'm used to having to do with the rear drum brakes on cars. So I'm going to sort of pop this out here. I don't think that we're going to have to reuse this bearing. I'll have to double check the kit. Just in case we do have to reuse it though, I'm going to be a little bit delicate with it. And so I'm just going to sort of store it right here in this cup from the previous dust cover. And that should allow the drum to come off of here. note that a little bit of wiggling may be necessary, but eventually it comes off. And note that the studs are actually part of the drum in this case, so don't be fooled by that. Alright, so now that the drum has been removed, the next thing we have to do is remove the brake shoes. Now if you have one of those handy hooked brake shoe removal tools, now would be a great time to use it. Unfortunately, I don't have one. So what I'm going to do instead is just grip this spring real tight here with these pliers and try to get it to pop off, and just make sure it doesn't hit me in the face. So this can be a little bit tricky, but if I grip it from the right spot, I can probably pop it loose on here. Now, I don't have to be too careful about preserving any of this because, of course, we're just going to be scrapping this entire drum brake system. So I can sort of go about a little bit lazier route to removing this. So there's one spring gone. We'll pop the next one out using the same sort of method here. So I'll grip that in there with that, and then use my flathead screwdriver to pop this out. There we go. So those springs are now loose. Now these springs here just need to be rotated in order to remove them. And so all I have to do is use some pliers like this to push in and twist until I can get them rotated in a way that they'll pop out, which can be a little bit tricky. Alright, so I was able to get all the springs eventually removed from here. I forgot that these springs right here actually have a piece that needs to be rotated about the stud that sticks out so that it lines up with the slot, and that popped out. So that's all removed, and then the next thing we're going to need to do apparently is remove the wheel cylinder. In order to do that, we're going to have to disconnect the brake line from the back end of it, and there's two bolts that come in from the backing plate that appear to hold that in place. So that'll be the next step. Alright, so now that all the springs and the brake shoes have been removed, this backing plate that also has the master cylinder on it has to be removed. Now, I tried to disconnect the original brake line up here, but unfortunately the fitting is stripped, so just like the same problems that we've run into where we're going to have to reroute the brake lines to the master cylinder, this piece of brake line is going to have to be replaced. So don't expect to do this job without possibly having to replace brake lines, or at least fittings, and re-flare some of these. So in the interest of expediency, since I'm going to handle all the brake line stuff later, I just cut the hose that went to the wheel cylinder on here, and then I removed 3 large bolts, one that went through here, and then 2 more that came through from the back on here and had nuts on them. Once those 3 were removed, then I was able to wiggle disassembly free, and then this whole piece comes off of the spindle, as you can see here, leaving the steering connection and the spindle itself. And as you can see, this spindle is very dirty, so I'm going to have to clean this up before I re-grease it and install the new brake kit. Now that the spindle's been cleared of all the dirt and grease that was on there, the next thing that I'm going to do is install this bracket that came with the front disc brake conversion kit. And so in order to do that, that's going to connect through these 2 holes right here onto the spindle. So we have the steering arm, and that's going to have to remain in place right here, and then this is going to go on the outside of that steering arm, and the bolts that were supplied with the kit, as well as the backing nut, are going to go through these 2 holes right here. So this will all be held in place from here. This top connection here will no longer be used for anything. Alright, so the bracket has now been installed on the spindle, and the steering arm has been attached to it. So these 2 bolts went all the way through both of them with a nut on the back side. And what I did was I used this long wrench in order to hold the nut in place while I used an impact gun, as you can see here, to tighten all of that up. So this is all on tight now. The next step is going to involve packing grease into the bearings so that we can then put them into the rotor and get the rotor installed on here. Alright, so the next step of this process is going to be to insert the wheel bearings into the rotor so that we can then put the rotor on the spindle. Before we do that though, we have to take the bearing and grease it. So this bearing right here has a bunch of rollers with needle bearings inside, and this is brand new so it doesn't have any grease on it. So what I'm using in this case is a wheel bearing grease that you can buy, and I'm going to take a scoop of this. It's nice to wear gloves when you do it, by the way, and try to get this in my hand, and then I am just going to mash this down onto this bearing. And what I'm trying to do is just mush a bunch of this gunk inside of this bearing so that it's more or less full of this grease. Now if we don't put this on, eventually these bearings will burn out on the front wheels here, so we want to make sure to have plenty of it packed in there. And I'll warn you, this grease does not smell very pleasant. Let's just make extra sure that we've got this, because it's something we really only want to do once. And so I want to get this good and packed in here. And I think that's about as pumped full of grease as we're going to be able to get. So now I'm going to take the wheel bearing and stick it in the back end of the rotor here. So what I've done, you can see here, is the rotor has a spot shaped exactly for it. I'm going to stick it right down in there, and then I'm going to grab this seal right here. This is the wheel bearing seal, and I'm going to put it so that this flat face is down and sort of stick it right in there. And then if I can get this glove off without too much mess, hopefully, I'm going to take a rubber mallet here, and I'm going to try to just get this tapped down inside. So I probably need to get both gloves off in order to do this, and sort of hold this in place. And try to get this seal tapped in here real tight. And that will hold that bearing in place. So now we're good with that. The next step will be to actually install the rotor onto the spindle. So I'll take the rotor here, and this is going to just slide right onto the spindle here. Alright, so the next step is going to be to take the outer wheel bearing, that's the smaller one, and also pack that one full of grease. So I'm going to do the exact same procedure that I did before, just mashing this thing full of grease as well as I can do. I'm just trying to really just push it through and get it just all up inside of here. We want this thing to be extra greasy so that the wheels will spin better. A little extra grease certainly will not hurt in this case. Alright, so now we've got this packed full of grease, and what we're going to do is stick it on the inside of the rotor. So right here, we slide this in over the threads right on there. And the outer part seems to be a little bit stuck on here in this case. But we're going to see if maybe we can just push it on with the nut. So, thanks to my wife, who's a registered nurse, who taught me a better way to pull the gloves off this time. And I'm going to take this nut, and we will use the nut to push the bearing into the rotor in this case. And so all I need now is just a large enough wrench to be able to get that on there. And because I don't have a super large wrench, I'm just going to use this adjustable set of pliers here. And we will adjust that onto here. so that then I can spin this nut in place. Now I have an impact wrench that I've been using for things, but in this case we really don't want to hit this with a lot of force because I don't want to damage any of the components. The spindle's sort of a fragile part on the car here, so I also don't want to over torque this too much. I just want to get it hand tight on there like this. And so with it hand tight on there, we can spin this rotor freely and see sort of how that grease affects it. I'm probably going to take this just an extra turn for good measure. If I can get the pliers that are on here. And see, in this case it really doesn't even want to go an extra turn, so we're fine there. Then I'm going to take my cotter pin, and I have to find the hole where that goes in, right here. And I'll push that through, and then I'll take the pliers, and I'm going to bend this cotter pin out like this. And that is going to keep the nut here from dislodging so that it can't work itself loose as I'm driving the car. So we'll take the pliers here and just make sure that, that is good and smashed on there. Alright, so this nut now should not be going anywhere. The wheel spins freely, and then the last step is to put the dust cap on. Alright, so the next step here is that I'm going to take this dust cap, which came with the kit, and I'm going to put it over here to protect that inner wheel bearing and make sure that no dirt can get in and get onto all the grease that we've just packed onto there. So what I'm going to do is take a rubber mallet here, and this can be a little bit tricky because we actually have to get this lined up straight. If it's not lined up straight, then it will go in crooked every time, and this can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to hit this here with the mallet. And it may take a few attempts to get this right, so don't be discouraged, but eventually it will go straight into there. So let's take this here to try to straighten it out. And you'll continue to do this until it goes on correctly. Alright, so now that we have the dust cover installed, the next step is going to be to install the calipers. Now the calipers came in this kit with the brake pads already in place, and they have these hex head screws on here, and they have the little adjustment sleeves to allow this to move back and forth. So I took the adjustment sleeves and pushed them back in. That's going to make it easier to slide this onto the bracket. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install this. Now this caliper is stamped as the right caliper, but the instructions that came with the kit clearly say the bleeder screw must be on top, and that's emphasized in bold. So if I want this bleeder screw on top, it's going to have to get installed here on the driver's side of the car. So we're going to do that. So with everything adjusted in place here, all I need to do is slide the caliper in place right onto the rotor here. And I just have to get it lined up in a way that it will fit in. And there's really only one way that this will fit, so it may take a slight bit of finagling to get it in here. And there we go. So now I take the bolts that were supplied, and what we're going to use for this one is a Allen screw. So I have a 3/8 inch Allen bit, and that's what's going to allow us to attach on here. So all I need to do is come into the back and screw this into the backing plate. Alright, we're now ready to do the rear disc brake conversion on this 1966 Cadillac Fleetwood Series 75. The first step in doing the rear disc conversion is going to be to remove the old drum brake. So I'm going to start by removing the rear drum here, and that's just pretty much a standard procedure for any rear drum brake car. Okay, so the rear drum has now been removed off of the braking system. This nut right here was screwed into the axle shaft So that was acting as a sort of retainer to hold the nut on. So if you don't pull this nut off, you won't be able to slide that drum off. But once I pulled it off, it was actually one of the easiest drums I've ever slid off of a wheel before. So with that off now, the next thing I'm going to do is disassemble the entire rear brake assembly. So I'm going to pull out all these springs in here, and I'm going to pull the shoes off as well. If you want to see the routine for this, check out my video from the front brakes. It's the exact same methodology. There's special tools you can use to remove each one of these springs carefully, but in this case, because I'm just going to be throwing out all of this and switching over to disc brakes, I don't have to be very careful about it, so I can just sort of rip these things out as long as I don't get a spring flying out and hitting me in the eye. Alright, so now that all the drum brake parts have been removed, the next thing that I'm going to do is try to disconnect the wheel cylinder from the brake line on the back, and this might end up being a bit of a challenge. And so that you can see what I'm talking about here, right there you can see there's a hard line that goes into the wheel cylinder. I've hit this with some WD-40, but the fittings on all the front brakes all stripped out on me, so I don't have a lot of faith in this one holding through. I guess we'll find out. Alright, so the brake line actually disconnected from the master cylinder without much difficulty, so it's nice to know I'll be able to reuse at least one flare fitting on here. Note now that the axle is not capable of turning, so I'm assuming there's a locking differential or something similar to that happening here, so I'm going to actually take the car out of park. Normally I always like to leave it in park whenever I'm doing a job like this, but I do have it up on a jack with a jack stand underneath for safety, and I have bricks in front of both the front tires, so in theory it shouldn't roll anywhere. And of course we want to make sure the parking brake is definitely not engaged, because of course we're going to be replacing the connection of it to the brakes here. I've already disconnected it on this wheel. So the axle shaft is being held into the axle housing by 4 nuts around here. And as you can see, there's a hole right here in the axle shaft, so I can spin it around to align with each one of those 4 nuts and unbolt it. So I've got to go and spin this around and unbolt all 4 of those so that I'll be able to pull the axle shaft out of the actual axle housing. Alright, so the next step, now that I've got all of these nuts that are holding the backing plate for the axle removed from here, is that I need to slide the entire axle out of the axle housing. Now, the shop manual and traditional practices would have you use a slide hammer for this, but lately I've seen a couple of videos that show how this can be done just using the old brake drum, so I'm going to try that approach. So what I'm going to do is take the brake drum here and mount it backwards on some of the wheel studs that we have, and then I'm going to take the lug nuts for the wheel, and I'm just going to thread a few of them on here. I'll go ahead and put 3 on in this case. That should be about enough. And what we're going to try to do is pull the axle out by using this brake drum as a hammer. So I should be able to budge it. I can get it loose. And there we go. So you may have noticed that I rather hurriedly removed the axle shaft. Of course, the one time that I'm unlucky enough to have rain here in Southern California is right when I'm in the middle of this. But what you'll see here is that the axle shaft has these splines that go into the differential, and here's the back end of it. So that slid out rather easily, and it's just important to make sure that that doesn't get gouged up at all. So I set it on this cardboard box so that it would be safe. So the next step that we're going to do here is remove the backing plate, and that is possible because I disconnected the brake line, as you can see there. But down here you'll see that I do have to disconnect the emergency brake from that backing plate so that it's loose, and then I'll be able to attach the emergency brake to the new brake kit. Alright, so now that the backing plate has been removed, what I've done is I've taken gentle care to bend the brake line back out of the way a little bit so it doesn't get in our way. And you can see there's the emergency brake down there. And here's the bracket that came with the rear disc brake conversion kit from caddydaddy.com. What I'm going to do is install this so that this depressed edge here is facing outwards, and I want to line the holes up so that these 2 points that stick out towards the back here face the rear, and that will be where the caliper is going to mount. So I just sort of get that on there like this, And here we've got everything in place. Now you'll note that we have these bolts and locking washers on the back end here of the new bracket. Those are going to need to be tightened up, but I'm going to wait to tighten that up until I have everything else on. Alright, so before I reinsert the axle shaft, what I'm going to do is take some of this grease here and just rub it around this seal. And that way we'll make sure that we don't get anything leaking out of there. Now the condition of the gasket on here isn't great, but I didn't think ahead to pick up one, so we're just going to sort of have to live with what we've got. I don't think it'll be too bad though. And the other thing I'm going to want to do here is sort of get some of the dirt and gunk off of this shaft right out at the end. So for that, I'm going to take this right here, this paper towel, and just sort of get that shaft a little rub down at the end there and try to get any of the gunk off of it. This doesn't have to be perfect, really. This car will probably need a new axle again someday, so no big deal. All right. So next, I'm going to put on these gloves here, and we will reinsert the axle shaft. And what I'm trying to do here is just sort of feel around for where this slides into the differential. May need to rotate a little bit, but sooner or later I should find that magic hole that this is looking for. Alright, so we don't quite have it there. Closer to getting seated here, and then what I need to do is just get the splines lined up on this. So got these bolts right here, and let's get the backing plate in. Trying to get the bolts for the backing plate to sort of run through it, and there we go. The rear axle is now reinserted, and at this point I can now get it set in place and retained here with the nuts that I took off. Alright, so now that the axle's back on and it's been tightened down, the next thing I'm going to do is tighten up these bolts right here. And these are the bolts that hold the assembly together to hold the caliper on there. So I'm just going to put a 11/16 wrench on one end and a ratchet on the other and get those tightened up. But they have the lock nuts on there, so they're a little bit stiff. So I won't be able to hold the camera while I do it. Alright, so now that I've got these pieces tightened down on here real good, everything seems very solid in place here. And what I want to do next is attach the rubber brake line to the steel brake line so that we can run this onto the caliper. So I'm going to take this silver adapter here, and I'm just going to screw this down into the brass type piece that we have on here and make sure that that's on real tight. Once that's on tight, I'm going to attach it onto here, and we'll have this in place before the rotor's here, so that way the rotor won't be getting in our way. Okay, the rubber brake hose is now in place. The next step is going to be to place the rotor onto the hub. So we can see I've got two different rotors that came with this kit. I want to pick the one where the slots that have been cut into it make sense in terms of the direction that the wheels will be spinning. Since we'll be driving this car in the forward direction most of the time, that would mean that I want them arranged like this. So I'm going to put the rotor on now and the caliper next. In order to keep the rotor well seated while I'm going to put the caliper on here, what I'm going to do is take a couple of lug nuts and I'm going to put them on here and just get it finger tight, so that way the rotor isn't tilted at an angle while I'm installing the caliper, because that'll just be one more wiggling thing to get in my way. Okay, the next step is going to be to install the caliper on the rotor. Now when I received this caliper, it actually had the piston on the caliper that pushes the inner brake pad out sort of extended somewhat. And I tried to compress it back with the C-clamp and that didn't work. Come to find out that because of the integrated e-brake in this caliper, you actually need a special tool that will both rotate and compress the piston to get it back in. So I had to go and do that before I could actually get this onto the rotor, otherwise the pads wouldn't fit on the rotor. So now we're ready to go ahead and install the caliper onto the bracket that was installed, and that's going to go onto the bolt holes that can be seen if I pop the rotor off here. These holes right here, which are part of the bracket. One final thing that you need to do is you need to connect the emergency brake, and the end of the cable here from the original car should slide around, back, and through this little slot on the new caliper here. And once that's connected, then that should activate the emergency brake. And once you tighten down the caliper, everything is all set with the installation. Of course, I have to connect the brake hose as well. Alright, so with the e-brake connected down here and with the brake hose connected, we are finally finished with the rear disc conversion. Now all we need to do is just bleed the brakes and everything should be all set.